In 1972, three American young men were on a trip to Mexico on a boat. However, their boat's engine broke down, and they got stranded in Mexico, where they met two fellow Americans. The two brothers were supposed to help them return to America, but they were hiding a dangerous secret that would lead everyone into serious trouble, ultimately ending up in one of Mexico's most dangerous prisons. Every day they spent in this prison could be their last, so they decided to carry out one of the most challenging prison escapes. The story is full of excitement, fast-paced events, and many surprises, so stay tuned and enjoy. In 1972, there were three American friends, Mike Cook, Miss Stanley, and Paul Smith. They were in their 20s and had a boat that worked with an engine and a sail. They set off from America, specifically from California, heading to the west coast of Mexico. At that time, there were no strict controls on maritime borders. The three friends reached the coast of a Mexican city after traveling a long distance without being stopped by any patrols. Their goal was simply to enjoy and have an adventure. However, their boat's engine broke down, and they had bought the boat cheaply due to their limited budget. They thought about how to use the remaining money they had, which was around $300. But this money was not enough to repair the engine, and even if they did repair it, they wouldn't have enough budget to continue their trip. So they started thinking about ways to make some money. They were using cannabis, so they bought some from the Mexican city and got into a local taxi, offering the driver cannabis for sale. They noticed that the cannabis was cheap compared to what was sold in America, being about 10 times cheaper. This price gap opened up a new idea. They thought about buying a large quantity of cannabis with the remaining money and selling it in America. This way, they could repair their boat and continue their trip. They went back to the same taxi driver who had sold them the cannabis and offered to buy a large quantity. They bought 10 kilograms of cannabis for $300 and miraculously returned to their boat. They needed to find a way to hide the cannabis before returning to America, so they thought about hiding it inside the surfboards. They opened the surfboards, removed the foam, put the cannabis inside, and then closed the boards again. They used some glue and sanding tools and managed to restore the surfboards to their original state. Anyone who saw the surfboards from the outside would never suspect what was inside, so they were very proud of the result they achieved. Their plan was to return to America with the broken boat, but when they tried to start the engine, it wouldn't start. They kept trying until it ran for a short time and then stopped again after a few minutes, indicating that the engine was no longer reliable and using it for sailing would be dangerous. So the three friends began thinking of another solution. They left the boat and started looking around for someone who could help them. They met two American men, one named Frank Sierra and the other his brother Dan Sierra. When they met them on the shore, they introduced themselves and started talking. The three friends told the brothers that their boat's engine had broken down and that they were stranded here. The brothers told them that they had a boat and were heading back to America, and if they wanted to join them, they were welcome. The three friends agreed immediately and took the surfboards filled with cannabis and went with the brothers on their boat, thinking they were hiding a secret from them. Little did they know, the brothers were hiding an even bigger secret. The next morning, Frank gave one of the friends some cannabis, and they started smoking together. They told the three friends that they were actually major cannabis smugglers and that the boat they were on contained a massive amount of cannabis, totaling 1,000 kilograms. This was the reason they were in Mexico, to transport this quantity. They bought this ton of cannabis for $3,000, and when they sell it in America, they will make a profit of about 10 times the amount, around $300,000. With inflation, this amount today could be worth around $2 million. They asked the three friends to help them with the sailing, and upon reaching America, to help store and distribute the cannabis in exchange for $10,000 each. The three friends hesitated, but eventually agreed to the tempting offer. The five of them set off on the boat back to America, and the journey was long. They would spend more than a week at sea, especially if they wanted to follow safe routes away from Coast Guard checkpoints. Days went by, and everything was fine until the seventh day. On that night, everyone was asleep except for one person, Paul Smith, who was steering the boat. The night was calm, and everything was fine until suddenly, without any warning, a violent collision occurred. The four who were sleeping were thrown from their places. Even the cannabis bags flew around, and everything turned into chaos within seconds, and the boat started to sink. It was likely that the boat had collided with a rock or something else in the water. Each person started to save themselves as the waves carried them to the shore, and the bags of cannabis were also washed ashore. The first thing they did was try to hide the bags of cannabis in the sand, because if the villagers discovered the bags, it would reveal that they were on the sunken boat and they would report them to the Mexican police. They dug with their hands as much as they could to hide bags, but they couldn't cover them with sand, so they covered them with leaves, making them easy to discover. They then got into a truck with the help of the villagers, and the five of them rode in the truck's cargo area, thinking they had escaped their crime. The truck drove off until it was stopped by a police car, which arrested the five men and took them to the station, where they were put in a cell. The police forced them to sign a confession of guilt and then transferred them to one of Mexico's notorious prisons, known for its lack of order and security. Mexican prisons are considered some of the worst places to be held, where prisoners endure the harshest conditions. The prison they were placed in resembled a jungle, where prisoners were thrown into an open area and the door was closed behind them, leaving them to fend for themselves. Upon their arrival, the other inmates gathered around them and eyed them with suspicion. They were fortunate that no one harmed them. Most of the inmates were drug addicts or involved with gangs and criminal activities. Fortunately for the five, they were together, which made it harder for others to single them out. Despite the discouraging conditions, they immediately began discussing their next step. The first idea that came to them was attempting to escape. Despite the difficulty of the task, they noticed some security gaps in the prison, which led them to believe that escape was possible. The next morning, they started exploring the prison for a way to escape. They noticed that the prison was surrounded by two walls, an inner wall 8 meters high with sharp glass shards attached to it, and an outer wall guarded by armed guards. After dismissing the idea of escaping over the walls, they decided that the only solution was to dig a tunnel underground. The problem was that the ground beneath them was not dirt, but concrete. They decided to dig from their cell, passing under the bathrooms, and then cross the inner wall to reach the outer wall. They estimated that the distance they needed to dig was between 10 to 15 meters. One of them noticed that maintenance workers were using small stones nearby, so he took one of those stones to use as a digging tool. Later, they bought a butter knife from one of the inmates to use as an additional tool. Although the tools were not ideal, they began digging near the cell wall, using a sheet to cover the person who was digging. The five prisoners started digging a tunnel to escape from the prison, following a strict watch system to avoid detection. They faced significant difficulty breaking through the concrete, and it took them 6 weeks to accomplish that. However, after opening the hole, they discovered that the ground beneath the concrete was clay and waterlogged, making further digging impossible. They tried to dry the clay, but to no avail, so they despaired and closed the hole, resigning themselves to staying in prison. 5 months later, something unexpected happened in the prison. The water that the prisoners used for bathing and toilets suddenly stopped. The news spread that one of the main pipes supplying water to the prison had broken or was leaking significantly, necessitating the water cutoff for repairs. 3 days passed without water, and then Mike, one of the five prisoners, remembered the hole they had dug and the water that had filled it. It occurred to him that the water cutoff might have dried the ground, and the broken pipe could have been the cause of the clay in the hole. The prisoners decided to investigate immediately. They moved the bed and removed the concrete cover, and to their surprise, the ground had dried and turned to dirt. They were filled with excitement and began working again. They brought a large plastic bucket and started removing the dirt from the hole. The digging process was quick at first, and within a few hours, they managed to dig almost a full meter vertically. Then they began digging the tunnel horizontally, but as they progressed, the soil became harder, so they had to use a small knife to continue digging. They faced a major problem with where to put the dirt they were extracting, as the prison floor was entirely concrete and they couldn't dispose of it easily. Eventually, they decided to hide the dirt under their beds, despite the significant risk of discovery by the guards or other inmates. As the prisoners dug faster, their chances of being discovered decreased. They relied on a shift system, with each one digging for 5 or 6 hours, while another helped remove the soil from the tunnel. After a week of continuous work, they had managed to dig about 3 to 4 meters, which was a reasonable distance. They knew they would have to pass under the bathrooms that were on their path and adjacent to their cell. During the digging process, Paul was working inside the tunnel when he suddenly struck something hard. He emerged from the tunnel, looking pale, and Mike, who was helping him remove the soil, asked, "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Paul replied, "I think I broke a sewer pipe, and it's now leaking into the tunnel." At that moment, a foul odor began to emanate from the tunnel. Even though the prison was filled with unpleasant smells, this odor was unbearable. Paul and Mike informed the other prisoners of what had happened, and they came to check the situation. It was a disaster. Even if they tried to clean the tunnel of the water and filth, it would be difficult to get rid of it easily. They knew that any attempt to transfer the filth to the toilets would send it back to the tunnel through the broken pipe. Since this pipe was the main drainage for all the bathrooms, all the prisoners' waste passed through it. Within a few hours, the tunnel was filled with waste. Although the ground absorbed some of the water, the situation was still dangerous. They needed to fix the pipe quickly to prevent the tunnel from filling up entirely and to avoid the guards discovering the problem. If the guards detected the smell or noticed that the drainage wasn't working properly, they might decide to search the cells, revealing the hidden soil under the beds and the tunnel they were working on. The bigger problem was that none of the five were willing to undertake the task of repairing the pipe. Each of them refused to take on the job, and they began to argue about who should go down into the tunnel. Realizing the situation was getting worse, they decided to find someone else to help and thought about recruiting a sixth prisoner named Benny, an American they had met over the past few months. Benny was known for being unreliable and scatterbrained, and they thought he might agree to take on the task. They brought Benny to their cell, showed him the tunnel, and explained their problem with the broken pipe. They offered him a deal. If he fixed the pipe, they would help him escape with them, and he wouldn't have to do any more tasks after that. After seeing the hole and smelling the odor, Benny said, "You guys are crazy. I'm not doing that." But after they promised him financial rewards and a large amount of drugs, he began to reconsider. Benny agreed to take on the task, and everyone felt hopeful and helped him prepare the equipment. They managed to get some cement powder, mixed it with water, and poured it into a coffee can. Benny entered the tunnel surrounded by filth and went to the broken pipe, using the cement to seal the crack. After completing the task, Benny emerged from the tunnel covered in dirt, but his work was successful. Thanks to Benny, the team now consisted of 6 members, and they celebrated solving the problem. They waited a few days for the tunnel to dry completely, though its odor remained unpleasant. They resumed digging diligently, working about 18 hours a day, with each taking turns. They crossed the internal wall and found themselves in the area between the inner and outer walls of the prison. Mike used a wooden spyglass with a small mirror piece installed to create a device similar to a periscope, and he could see that they were very close to the surface. After the team had dug a considerable distance, they discovered that the distance between the tunnel and the surface was very small. Mike used a rudimentary periscope he made himself to estimate the remaining distance and found they were only 2 or 3 meters away from reaching the outer wall of the prison. This discovery encouraged the team, and they began to intensify their efforts to speed up the digging. The next phase of the operation depended on Frank and Dan, as Dan had contacts outside the prison who arranged for 2 cars for the escape. They set a date for leaving the prison on the 3rd night from now and waited for the arrival of the cars and drivers at the designated location. But on the following night, something unforeseen happened. Heavy rain fell. As water seeped into the tunnel, the opening expanded, and the water began to flow in large quantities. The team was in a state of panic, fearing that the tunnel might collapse due to the increasing weight of the water. They waited anxiously, expecting the guards to discover the situation at any moment. But the next morning, the team was surprised to find that the guards had not arrived. The tunnel had withstood the rain, and despite the dampness, it did not collapse. They quickly dried out the tunnel and emptied the water and resumed digging, hoping they could escape on the scheduled night. They continued working in shifts, each person working hard to ensure the success of their plan. They kept digging until around 2 a.m. and started to feel that they were close to surpassing the outer wall of the prison. Of course, if they had more time, they would have preferred to dig further to avoid the wall and the prison more, but they were very late, so they had to act quickly. Immediately, they entered the tunnel one after another and performed a clever trick before entering. They wore their clothes inside out or backwards, so they would get dirty from the inside while crawling through the tunnel, and when they emerged from the other end, they would turn the clothes back to make them look clean. The six began crawling through the tunnel, and according to the plan, the end of the tunnel was closed and would only open at the moment of exit. The person at the front was Mace, who was wearing a ski mask he had obtained somehow during his time in prison. Mace's task was to open the exit hole at the end of the tunnel, using the mask to protect his face from the dirt and dust that would fall. Opening the exit was not easy. The ground above them was quite hard. Mace continued to hit and dig with a butter knife, while his friends waited in the tunnel until he finished. After about 15 minutes of hard work, the exit began to open in front of them, and they were all excited and happy. But when Mace poked his head out of the hole, he quickly returned to the tunnel and told them that the light from outside was very bright and the street was fully illuminated, which meant that anyone passing by or a guard might easily see them. His friends asked if he had seen anyone outside, and he replied that he had not seen anyone and that the place was empty. They all agreed that there was no turning back now, and they had to get out quickly. Mace went out of the hole first, followed by his friends one after another, and when each one of them emerged, they went straight to the wall to hide so that no guard could see them from above. Thus, all six were outside the tunnel and ready for the next phase of the escape. Mike was watching from a corner of the outer wall, where the place was completely exposed to the guards. They had to cross the main prison gate to reach the street. Despite their desire to run, they knew that any sudden movement might arouse suspicion. Also, the prison's location, surrounded by residential areas, helped them, as it was likely that the guards would think they were returning to their homes even though it was around 3 a.m. They continued walking calmly until they were far from the prison, then started running, delighted and excited about their freedom. Now they needed to reach the place where the cars were waiting for them before dawn and the guards discovered their escape. They arrived at the agreed-upon location in high spirits, but their enthusiasm quickly faded when they did not find the cars that Dan was responsible for organizing. Dan asked them why the cars were not there, and they answered that they were at another place agreed upon with them. He added that they might be there if they could not reach this location. The second spot that Dan had identified was near a railway track, so they went with Dan and continued running until the sun began to rise, fearing that police patrols might start searching for them if the guards discovered their escape. They stood by the side of the road near the railway track, waiting for the cars. Suddenly, they saw two cars coming from afar and wondered if these cars were the ones they were waiting for. Dan was watching the cars, and when they approached, he confirmed they were theirs and smiled, which increased their happiness. They knew at that moment that they had gained their freedom after 7 months in prison. They said their goodbyes, with 3 of them getting into one car, while the brothers and Benny got into the second car. After a while, Benny got out and took a separate path, receiving his reward in the cannabis he was promised. The brothers, who were wanted in America on drug trafficking charges, headed to southern Mexico and did not return to America. Meanwhile, the 3 friends decided to return to America via the land border, where their passports were still with them. They encountered no difficulties at the border and returned to their country safely. And so, we have reached the end of our story. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. You can watch previous videos and other interesting stories on the channel. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video, and goodbye.